Hello. Today's presentation is on single event trauma, complex trauma, and the neuroscience of traumatic stress. As school psychologists, we get a lot of exposure to things like specific learning disabilities, autism. We don't spend a lot of time talking about trauma, yet trauma has a significant impact on the way that our students experience the classroom and the way that their behaviors shift and change. So why is this important? Why are these different types of trauma and an understanding of the neuroscience of this trauma? Why does that matter for us? First, over the last decade, there's been an absolute explosion in the research associated with trauma. It has significantly expanded our understanding of the way that both adults, but most especially children, experience trauma. The way that they deal with the effects of something like this and the impact that it can have. However, teachers and administrators typically receive very little training when it comes to trauma. They often don't have access to information about what can happen, how it can affect people, and the ways that they should deal with trauma in their classroom. Research suggests, though, that 25 to 35% of our students in the school setting have experienced a significant traumatic event or a pattern of traumatic events that have led to adverse impact in their functioning in the school setting. Complex trauma, which we're going to define in just a few moments, has a significant impact in socioeconomically stressed communities and environments. In those communities, children impacted by trauma can be as high as 70 to 80%. We know that trauma, especially chronic trauma, can have a significant impact on kiddos. What we've seen, though, is that it can not just impact behavior, it impacts cognition and it impacts relationships as well. Traumatic stress also goes a very long way in providing a neurobiological mechanism to understand the achievement gap between high SES communities and low SES communities. So first we're going to start with single event trauma. Single event trauma is kind of what we all think about when we think of trauma. This is a car crash. This is going off to war. For a child, it may be the loss of a parent. For anyone, it may be a traumatic car accident. It could be a natural disaster. These traumas have a very discrete beginning and end. You have life before the trauma, you have the trauma, and you have life after the trauma. When we find out that a kiddo in our school has undergone a single event trauma, their house burned down, their parent was killed. These are some of the responses that we typically have to that child. We have compassion for them. We have understanding and patience that it's going to take a while before they're back to normal. We tend to expect emotional and behavioral reactions after the event. We don't expect them to be behaviorally perfect. We expect them to have anger, frustration, and work those things out in behaviors in the classroom. And that behavior is understood as separate from the child. This is a reflection of the event, not a reflection of who that child is. We don't expect as high self-control, and we tend to be very nurturing. These single event traumas can often strengthen relationships. We circle the wagon around these children, and we try and figure out ways that we can help them. Single event trauma also has a direct relationship to the DSM-5 diagnosis PTSD. This is the primary trauma diagnosis that we have in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That is the book that mental health clinicians use to diagnose people with mental health concerns. So in PTSD, it's largely informed by single event traumas. It's really these symptoms, these items that characterize PTSD, these are really informed by single event traumas. So PTSD is defined as a pattern of these behaviors that extends more than 6 months after the event. If it's less than 2 months, it's an acute stress disorder. If it's less than 6 months, it's an adjustment disorder. But anything that starts to look more chronic, that's when it becomes PTSD. And so here we see some of the diagnostic characterizations. So first, it's exposure to a traumatic event. The DSM does get very specific, though, on what that traumatic event looks like. It has to include either witnessing or experiencing a trauma that either threatens one's life, or actual death, includes serious injury or sexual violation. These are very big traumas. The bar is set very high on what kind of traumas can be included in the PTSD diagnosis. They can also include direct exposure or witnessing the trauma. So this is a kiddo who maybe saw their parent killed, or who witnessed some sort of violent assault. The second part is intrusive re-experiencing of the traumatic event. That can be nightmares, that can be flashbacks. In children, that can be re-experiencing through play, to where the child reenacts the trauma in their play in a repetitive way. Avoidance of trauma reminders. This can be avoiding places that remind you of the trauma, scents, smells, tastes, sounds that remind you of the trauma. It can also be avoiding emotions that are associated with the trauma, avoiding fear, avoiding connection and intimacy. You're also going to see a negative alteration in cognition or mood. This is kind of to be expected. After a significant trauma, you're going to experience things, or you may experience things like depressed mood, anxiety, worry, fear. You may have poor concentration, a negative self-perception, and shame. Finally, and this is a big one as we move through the training, you're going to see significant alterations in arousal and reactivity. You're going to see things like hypervigilance. When someone walks into the room, they're constantly scanning to see where the exits are, who's there, is this a safe situation. You may see hypermotor behavior, tapping, moving around, being restless. You may see an exaggerated startle reflex where a loud noise or a sudden sound can cause someone to jump in their skin, their heart to race. You can also see some of the physical signs of anxiety. So hand shaking, feeling out of breath. These are some of the criticisms of the PTSD diagnosis. First of all, it is primarily reflective of adults who experience a single event trauma as adults. So really it's not very open and mindful of the experience that children go through who experience trauma, or who experience a pattern of trauma. It has a very limited allowance for the developmental part of trauma. And it really is a poor vehicle for understanding the context and guiding interventions related to trauma. Really, that diagnosis is, are these symptoms present? Okay, this is a label that we apply to that. It doesn't really give you a lot of room to come up with ways to help. So that's single event trauma. Now I want to get into complex trauma. Complex trauma is also called developmental trauma. It's characterized as a pattern of multiple traumas across a long period of time. That can be several years, that can be a lifetime, and what we often see is the complex trauma becomes generational. It gets passed from mother to child, parent to child, across generations. Typically it begins in early childhood. It can begin in a chaotic environment for a baby, for a toddler. Violence and overt abuse does not have to happen for complex trauma symptoms to emerge. This is not just the kids who get hit. This is not just the kids who get molested. These are kids who are exposed to a chronic pattern of instability, chronic pattern of situations where they feel unsafe, where they feel fear. The impact of this is pervasive. It doesn't just affect some of the symptoms that we saw in the PTSD diagnosis. It affects cognition. It affects your ability to maintain emotional stability. It also affects, as we're going to see next, your fundamental neurological structure. This video was created for the California District Attorney and Attorney General. And so a lot of the messaging in here is primarily related to domestic violence, but I want you to expand your view of this into traumatic stressors in general. This could be a situation where a family has chronic housing instability, to where sometimes they're on the street, sometimes they're renting a room, and a child never knows whether mom and auntie are going to get into a fight and we're going to be back on the streets again. This could be related to community violence, when there is an uncertainty of your safety, when there are drive-bys in your neighborhood, when you never know if it's safe. So domestic violence is huge, and it's very appropriately captured here, but expand that frame out to chronic patterns of instability and chaos.
Because of the way the brain works, you will always remember your very first roller coaster ride. Storing these new experiences is one of the brain's main jobs. In fact, your brain creates a mental blueprint of every new experience you have. A blueprint for any new touch is stored in one part of the brain. A blueprint for any new sound in a different part. And a blueprint for any new sight in still another part. But as powerful as that first roller coaster ride was, it can't compete with the lingering effects of your brain's earliest experiences. Although you have no conscious memory of this part of your childhood, it is these very first experiences that literally become the building blocks for your whole life.
Unlike other organs, the brain is undeveloped at birth, and it is waiting for experiences to shape how it will develop. The amazing thing about the human brain is that the younger you are, the more sponge-like your brain is. Which is the reason that children in 3 years can learn language, can learn to walk, can do all kinds of incredible things. But the very same biological sponginess that allows us to rapidly acquire language is also the same sponginess that makes young children more vulnerable to trauma than older children.
And we had the opportunity to do police ride-alongs to a domestic violence situation, and so this was actually the first call I ever rode along. It was dinner time, and they were having spaghetti for dinner. It was dripping down the walls, the kitchen table was overturned. We had 3 children in the household. Looking at this whole situation at the time, we said, no evidence of physical harm, the kids are fine. We learned differently, of course. The boy in the corner was classic behavior that we see with kids who have had chronic exposure to violence. He would just completely zone out, numb out as things started to get scary. The 6-year-old little girl on the chair blames herself for what's going on, but actually it was 4 years later that we really appreciated who had some of the most profound or severe harm coming out of this situation, and that was the 6-month-old baby who was now 4 and a half and had seriously injured another child in preschool.
It's literally the opposite of the way most people think about this. Most people think young children, they don't really understand what's going on and they're resilient. But the fact is, if anybody's impacted more severely, it's the younger child.
The brain is put together like building blocks in a sense. Those first blocks that go together in the more primitive area, the survival brain.
The brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out. So that the normal development of the top part of the brain depends upon healthy development of the lower parts of the brain. The top part of the brain, where you do all of everything, is the part of the brain that is most changeable, easiest to modify. But unfortunately, if a child has developmental experiences of threat, exposure to domestic violence, the lower parts of the brain will be impacted and are harder to change as they get older.
He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. There was lots and lots of screaming in front of the kids, berating, putting me down, and he pretty much heard it all.
Children exposed to domestic violence, children who witness their parents fighting, literally are experiencing a state of fear. And when this happens, the systems in your brain that are involved in thinking at the top part of your brain are literally shut down. It changes the brains of these children.
My son has seen and heard a lot of the violent outbursts. He was experiencing night terrors, and that was probably his way of dealing with it, because in his waking state, he didn't know how to articulate at 2.5 years old. So it was coming through when he was asleep. When kids are chronically stressed, one of the problems that we see
is difficulty in attachment and bonding. Because they're so focused on survival, it's hard for them to reach out and connect with others.
My oldest boy went through a stage where he would bully his younger brother and seemingly laugh in glee. He was not remorseful or had no empathy that he could actually make someone cry. Many phone calls of him being disruptive in the classroom. He was a very bright kid, but that's when I knew that he was heading toward trouble.
A lot of these kids get labeled as being, bad, difficult, defiant. This is a very natural response to their circumstance. What the child is doing is a survival strategy for them, but it creates behaviors that are very difficult in the classroom. When they're in crisis mode, they can't learn.
The tragic reality of children growing up in domestic violence is that they end up with mental health problems at a rate higher than children who are actually the direct victims of physical abuse.
My mother was a victim of domestic violence. My father was an alcoholic and drug user, and just a cocktail for a bad living environment for our children. My brother, he looked like he was crying on the way home. Me not knowing, I was just a careless little 6-year-old, seeing him climb up to my mom's medicine cabinet. I asked him what he was doing, and he boldly said, "I'm killing myself." 8-year-old, something like that. First person I got to call was my best friend's mom. By the time she came down to our apartment, he had a butcher knife in his hand, just cutting himself all over his body. I was just bawling, just crying. There was nothing I could do to help. My brother was crying. He didn't want to be there. He was trying to run out. But I had already known that my home, wasn't my home. It wasn't a place where I felt safe.
Childhood exposure to violence is about living in a threatening, scary environment that may escalate to physical violence, but it often doesn't have to. It's the chaos, the uncertainty, the fear of being in a home where things aren't okay. Very interesting talking about the roller coaster, because that's what we hear from adult survivors who are in violent households and also the children. The hard part for them, I think, is thinking about what is normal instead of this up and down life of being in a violent, threatening relationship.
Growing up in my home, there were 6 children. My mother and father, unfortunately, fought like cats and dogs. As a result of that, 2 of my brothers ended up being batterers. I have 2 sisters. Even today, they may commit that act.
Exposure to violence is a lifetime legacy. We see that adults who have had negative childhood experiences often have coping behaviors that can be unhealthy. That certainly has huge effects on how one is going to parent.
It's really important for parents to understand that their internal state, whether it's calm, or whether it's alert engagement, or whether it's frustration and anger, or whether it's sadness, depression, the baby absorbs these internal states.
I have been in the moment with that sense of helplessness and hopelessness and stress and anxiety and rage. It really damages the brains of small children to be under a constant level of stress and anxiety.
Every day I hope that I haven't damaged my kid in any way.
They need to see from you as a
I think that video does a really fantastic job of showing how trauma is not really what we think in a young child. We think of how horrific it is for older children to be exposed because they understand what's happening to them. But what that video shows, and what I hope to show you with some of the neurophysiology and the neuropsychology of trauma, is that it's actually the impact on the youngest brains that creates the most lasting effect. So first I want to go back to kind of neurophysiology 101. The brain is arranged in a sequential and hierarchical manner. At the bottom, we have the brainstem, which is the most developed at birth. So there we see the cerebellum, we see the brainstem. That's really focused on the automatic processes of the body, the things that we don't need to think about. It would be really cognitively draining if we had to sit here and think, okay, heart beat, 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 beat. Wouldn't be very efficient. So all of that happens outside of our conscious control. It's just automatic processes that the body goes through. The diencephalon is really where a lot of our motor control happens. This is how we move our bodies. This is how I'm speaking to you today. It's because I'm choosing to engage my diaphragm, and I'm standing here and I'm able to use my leg muscles to keep me upright. It also monitors arousal, which is going to be very significant as we talk about trauma and trauma reactions, as well as appetite and when we feel full. The next part up is going to be the limbic system. That's our emotional brain. That is where we experience emotional regulation. That's where we experience emotional dysregulation. When we feel really upset, when we feel really stressed out, when we've got 3 finals next week and we aren't sure how we're going to get it all done. That's a lot of limbic system activation. We also see sexual behavior really kind of governed in this area, as well as the earliest parts of attachment, which leads into the neocortex. That's the gray wrinkly bits up on the top of your brain. These are the most sophisticated parts of our brain, and it's also the part of our brain that's most human. This is where we're going to see abstract thought, creativity, concrete thought, language, and then also affiliation, how we connect with others and make meaning from that. Attach is I need you, affiliation is this is what you mean to me. We also have input and stress response systems. So the input system is going to be our somatosensory system, and they receive the information coming from our 5 senses. So they receive visual information coming through the eyes, auditory information coming through the ears, tactile information coming through the skin. They're going to process this information to make meaning out of it, not higher order meaning. This is very, very rudimentary processing. It's also going to pay a lot of attention to our internal worlds. Do we feel balanced physically? Am I wobbling around right now? What sorts of internal sensations do I have? Do I experience a sense of my heart racing, adrenaline shooting down my fingertips? These systems are uniquely sensitive to novelty. They're always on the hunt for what is something new, what is something different, what is something I need to be alert to, and how can I return myself back to equilibrium? How can I get back to a balanced, chill, cool state of being? The way that it achieves that is through the response systems. The brain has key systems that regulate our responses to the input, the way that we rebalance if we feel off balance. And these responses can occur at each level of the brain. So lower order processing happening in the brainstem and the diencephalon level, it's going to respond automatically. It's also going to respond to higher level processing at the limbic and the neocortex level. All of these systems, again, are aimed at returning someone to equilibrium. We want to get back into a state of balance. And so this video is going to discuss some of the ways that because of the hierarchical orientation of our brain, we experience what's called state-dependent functioning, where different parts of the brain control the way that we respond to the world. Different parts of the brain assume the locus of control to dictate our responses.
Set of networks that are continually monitoring the world, and you have a set of networks that are continually able to act on that information. Now, one of the first things that happens is when your brain starts to get information that tells you what's going on inside and outside, is that there will be a determination about what parts of the brain you really should be using, what parts of the brain should be in control, what parts of the brain should be regulating and monitoring your functioning in that moment. So when you get signals from your body and from the outside world that say, listen, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you're in this nice equilibrium, you're in a safe and familiar environment, the sensory environment's not very complex, there's not a whole lot of novelty, you can literally be calm. And you use the parts of your brain that are most human, that are most complex, and that allow you to be future-oriented and think in essentially the smartest way that you can think. You can be creative and you can put things together that you had previously learned, and you can see them in a unique way, you can revisit them, and you can move them around. And essentially, this is a wonderful, wonderful reflective state that is responsible for the majority of human creativity and innovation. As you start to get signals from the world that it's a little bit more complex, that things are, there's a little novelty out there, there's something I need to focus on in the external world, you get to an active alert state. And you start to use lower parts of the brain to control your functioning. And you move away from these higher, more complex, abstract thinking parts of the brain to parts of the brain that are more concrete. And as you start to get signals that say, hey, I'm under threat, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm cold, I've got some unknown signals that are coming from the outside world, some of them might be even threatening, your brain shifts and starts to use lower parts of the brain in a predominant way. Essentially, in a state-dependent way, the locus of control is moving from higher parts of the brain to lower parts of the brain as you become increasingly threatened. And as I've sort of gone through here, you go from the neocortex all the way down to your brainstem when you feel particularly fearful or terrorized. And so what happens is your brainstem actually is a part of the brain that will manage information and process information and, quote, solve problems in a way that's very different than the top part. So when you're calm, like I said, you can be abstract and reflective. You can be future-oriented. You can really solve problems in an innovative, quote, humane way. And as you start to feel a little bit of complexity in the external world, when things get a little bit more, if you will, stressful, you will be likely to use your cortex, but you take these parts of your cortex that are a little bit more automatic, a little bit more routine. Things, you solve current problems with old problem-solving paradigms. Again, in a state of alarm, as you get more threatened, your style of cognition shifts to be much more emotional and ultimately reactive. And then finally, when you're in a state of fear, you really aren't thinking. You're essentially reactive. And in your behavior and your, quote, problem solving in that moment is very reflexive. This, of course, is good if you have a situation where you don't have the time to process and come up with a solution, and you just need to act. You need to jump out of the way of the train. You need to immediately remove your hand from the hot object. That's appropriate. But it's really not going to result in a very complex solution to a problem if you are in a state of high alarm or fear and you are trying to solve complex problems. You will get categorical in many ways, very black and white type solutions. You will not see things in a complex, nuanced way.
So in that video, Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a preeminent researcher right now on the neurocognitive effects of developmental trauma, he's looking at state-dependent functioning. State-dependent functioning really relies on developmental neuroscience, and it informs the way that trauma can impact the development of the brain. So here we see, again, the brain develops in a way that is hierarchical and that is sequential. So the lower areas of the brain are less complex, but they're also less plastic. Plastic being referring to their ability to change and adapt to experiences in the environment. As you move up, it becomes more complex, more plastic, and also takes longer to develop. These different areas organize and become fully functional at different times throughout childhood. So this is the stress response systems that I referred to earlier. These can be the norepinephrine system, the serotonin system, the dopamine system, and all of these systems actually begin down in the, wait one moment. All of these systems start down in the brainstem, and they go down into the body. They work downstream in terms of sending out information about how the body should respond to a stressor or a novel situation. They also move upstream and inform the way that you interpret a situation. As you move higher upstream, the more complex the interpretation and the response becomes. In a developing brain, neurons going upstream in these response systems become morphogens. They actually dictate how the higher areas of the brain are going to develop. When a newborn is born, his or her brainstem is pretty well developed. His heart beats, he can breathe, he can digest, he can handle all of those things. The higher areas of his brain are kind of a tangled mess. There's a lot of neurons, far more neurons than he's ever going to need. And they aren't really organized very well. These morphogens actually, in an experience-dependent way, move up into those undifferentiated areas of the brain and guide and shape the way that they're going to organize. This shaping of the undifferentiated networks is going to impact everything from executive functioning, attention, planning, strategy, to their personality, health, even longevity. This is because of use-dependent development. What we use gets reinforced. What we don't use gets lost. And that's definitely a rule when it comes to neurological differentiation. A newborn's brain is literally waiting for experiences to tell it how to organize itself, to help tell it how to shape. And these undifferentiated neural networks are critically dependent on experience to tell them how to develop. There are some periods that are critical for development, like exposing the eye to light in the first couple months of life. If a newborn's eyes, even if they're functional, aren't exposed to light, their brain won't learn how to process visual information. So even though the light is coming in, they're functionally blind. You're also going to see periods that are sensitive to exposure, like language development. A person who learns a language picks up language in general after the age of 3 is never going to be very fluid with it. A person who picks up language in adulthood, another language, a second language, is always going to speak with a little bit of an accent. That's because the brain is already shaped and it's lost the opportunity of this sensitive period. This leads to periods of development where the brain is more sensitive or less sensitive. So if you have a pattern of complex trauma, of stressors, of exposure to fear, to violence, to terror, you have a much higher likelihood of you tapping into one of these sensitive periods and really creating a brain that is primed for those kinds of emotions and reactions. Distorted or disturbed organization can lead to diminished functional capabilities in the specific neural system where the development was disrupted. This can include attention. You see significant attention concerns in children who experience complex trauma. This can be in emotional reactivity in the limbic system. One thing that's interesting is 90% of the adult synaptic connections that are use-dependent are formed in the first 3 to 4 years of life. So my brain is fundamentally shaped by what my life looked like from the ages of 0 to 4. And that has fundamentally impacted the person that I am today. This is a quote by Dr. Bruce Perry. The sensitive brain of an infant or young child is more malleable to experience than a mature brain. While experience may alter the behavior of an adult, experience literally provides the organizing framework for an infant and child. Because the brain is more plastic in early childhood, the child is most vulnerable to variance of experience during this time. So this brings us to the stress response. The stress response is the way that we deal with novel stimuli in our environment that triggers a response that it may be a threat. The somatosensory networks continually get this input from the outside world. I can attend to the lights up here, the sound of the air conditioning, the sound of my own voice echoing in the room. None of that is threatening right now, so my body's not reacting to it very much. But if something novel happened, if there's a large crash against the window, my stress response would immediately react because of the novelty and the potential threat. Our brains are also uniquely able to process this information at different levels. So if I go to the beach in a month and a half when it's really hot, I'm going to walk out onto the sand in my bare feet, and I'm going to take my first step onto the sand, and my foot's immediately going to pull back because it's boiling hot. I don't have to think about the fact that, maybe I should remove my foot from the boiling hot sand so that I don't get third-degree burns on my soles. I immediately move it back. While I'm processing that, I'm looking around to see where there are places to sit. As I walk onto the stand, my diencephalon is continually adjusting to the abnormal surface to make sure that I stay in balance. I'm thinking about whether I'm hungry or not for the sandwiches that I've packed. I'm thinking about how frustrated I was that it took me 45 minutes to find parking, but how happy I am that we're finally here. I can also pull in the neocortex, make meaning out of this experience, talk about how I've been looking forward to going to the beach all summer, how this is one of my happy places, what that means to me. All of these levels of processing can happen just based on the input that you're getting from the outside world. But the lower levels of the brain are much, much faster. I remove my foot from that hot sand far faster than I ask what the waves mean for my understanding of rhythm. There is a much faster and immediate response to stimuli that activates the lower parts of the brain. Our brains are evolutionarily primed to be attuned to internal and external stimuli and to continually assess it for potential threat. We are constantly on the lookout for potential threat, even if we don't realize it, even if it doesn't reach our conscious thinking. So I'm being mindful of the way that chairs are moving around in other rooms right now to see if someone's coming in here. I'm not attending to that very much until I bring my awareness to it. As I said before, our stress response systems are primarily geared at returning us to equilibrium. Stress is not necessarily bad. We use it as kind of a dirty word in our society that, oh, she's stressed, she needs to go on stress leave, she's stressed out, no one's taking care of their stress. That's actually not the case. Stress is good. Stress is fundamental for development. If the brain is not stressed and exposed to novelty, it can't develop. But the pattern of stress and the way that that individual is able to regulate that stress is fundamental to how a person develops. Healthy, low to moderate intensity and frequency stress in the early environment actually leads to a well-functioning adult. It's chronic stress, threat, and this feeling of never being certain of one's safety that creates an environment where the lower parts of the brain are chronically activated and the higher parts of the brain struggle because they aren't being activated and organized in a way that is appropriate. So, to talk about the healthy look at stress, we're going to look at what healthy attachment looks like.
Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about attachment theory and how it impacts student behaviors. And I think that the best way to talk about attachment is to actually go back to remember what it was like to be a baby. And if you remember, as soon as you're born, you're pretty much helpless and utterly dependent on your parents to take care of you. And also, if you're ever in danger, you're being threatened or hunted, then the best way to survive is actually to stay as close to your parents as you can. So what a good enough parent does is that they figure out how to take care of you. They read your cues, they learn your cries, and then they meet your needs. Now we as babies play our part too. If we're easy to soothe and regulate, then it makes parenting us really easy. But if we have issues that are like being colicky or hypersensitive or difficult to soothe for some reason, then it can make any parent struggle to take care of us. Now it's this fit between parent and baby that really helps to define what kind of attachment we end up developing. Now if our parents are good enough and we ourselves are pretty easy to soothe, then we end up developing what they call a secure attachment. We learn that when we feel scared or we need help, then someone's going to be there for us, and it provides for us this secure base from which we can do anything else in the world. And then if we know that someone's there to listen to us, then as we learn to speak instead of just cry all the time, then we try to make our needs known. And over time, our parents keep meeting those needs, and it gives us more and more confidence to say what our needs are, and have this expectation that others are going to meet that need. And then the other really cool thing that happens is that deep down inside, we start to feel like, hey, you know what? Maybe I deserve to be taken care of. I guess I'm pretty lovable. I'm a pretty decent person for my parents to love me the way they do and take good care of me. But the other cool thing that happens in development is that our own abilities start to come online. We get to walk, we get to talk, we get to run and climb and do things, and that brings another kind of delight to us. And as we start to become really good at stuff, we develop pride in ourselves. And our brains are designed to constantly seek new stimulation. So as we develop these new abilities, we want to go explore the world as much as we can. And if we feel safe in the world because of our secure attachment, then we're more likely to explore and feel really good about it because we know that if something bad happens, someone's going to be there to catch us. Someone has our back. And now we have these two competing delights in our life. The first one is the delight in being held and loved and secure and knowing that someone's going to take care of us. And then the other delight is the delight in our own ability to go out into the world and get something done. And these two competing delights, this delight in our agency and a delight in our connectedness to others, becomes these two things that we have to balance for the rest of our lives. And it gets recalibrated with each developmental challenge. Now you can imagine what a secure baby looks like as a student. This baby walks into the school pretty confident. Sure, they're going to fuss and cry a little bit when they first leave their moms and dads because they love being with them. But they easily and quickly transition to being in school because they love exploring and learning new things. There's a sense of confidence, there's a sense of openness and a authenticity about who they are as people. And there's a pleasure that they get from just being at the school. When they're studying and when they're learning new things, they might need help every once in a while, and when they do, they have no qualms about asking for help. They'll raise their hand, they'll call on the teacher to help, and then when they get the help, they're ever so grateful that they get the help, because it just feels like what they got when they were little babies. And then other students really like them too, because they're friendly, they're open, they're warm, and because they felt love in their life for so long, they know how to give love to other people. And this is the type of student that teachers really like teaching. They're delightful, they're eager to learn, they're open to being helped, and they're so grateful for the teacher being there for them.
So most of us have learned about attachment in child development classes and the importance of healthy early attachment. And I think that video did a great job of talking about how appropriate connection with a good enough parent. You do not have to be the ultimate Pinterest parent of all time. It's a good enough parent who responds appropriately to their child. That video really highlights the way that appropriate response can lead to regulation, to higher order things such as self-esteem, belief in one's own abilities, confidence, creativity. The mechanism of that is that a toddler or a baby experiences distress that is relatively predictable. It's not something that is extreme, it's something like hunger or thirst. And that when they experience that distress, they verbalize it. They cry, they fuss. And then mom or dad comes in and relieves the distress. They respond to the baby's vocalization, fussing, and then they relieve the distress, and that results in relief. And this pattern happens hundreds of times a day. It's not just dirty diapers. It's when they feel uncomfortable and you look over and you move their blanket. It's when they are fussing and you pick them up and you hold them and you bounce them a little bit. This pattern of distress response and regulation, and then the experience of relief happens countless times in a child with a good enough parent. And that becomes the framework for giving their brain that undifferentiated system and organizing pattern to create regulation later in life. What that creates is tolerance. So if you look here, tolerance happens when stimuli, in this case adverse stimuli, stress, distress, discomfort, occurs at a low to moderate intensity. The frequency is moderate, and most important, the pattern is consistent and predictable. This is what you actually see in psychotropic or in drugs as well, with opioids. If you, after surgery, are supposed to take the Vicodin for 6 days, twice a day, it's going to do a lot more at the beginning than it does at the end. That's because your body's developed tolerance. Your body develops tolerance for stress as well. If you look here, the stressors are consistent. They're not jumping around. And so the response to the stressor here is getting a little bit lower each time. From an attachment perspective, the distress happens, baby gets worked up, gets excited, screams, mom comes in and resolves, takes away the distress, and they feel relief. Something else happens and they go up, but they go up a little bit less because their nerve systems are telling them it's going to get taken away, it's going to get resolved. So ultimately, you see over a long period of time of that pattern of distress, response and regulation, relief, you see tolerance to stressors. This happens at the neuron level. This happens at the level of a neuron firing in response to a stressor. But it has a cascade to a pattern of complex response and functioning. So this is the firing of a single neuron. But when you take all of the neurological activity in totality, this becomes a child that can tolerate stress. We see the opposite effect, though, with a different, more difficult and hurtful, harmful form of stress. Sensitization happens when stressors, when stimuli are inconsistent in intensity, when they lack a perceivable pattern, when the frequency, the duration, all of it's inconsistent. You never know what you're going to get. So here we see stressor up here, it spikes you up here. Something small, something big. You see that the intensity changes. You also see that the period of time between these stressors change. So if you think about a startle response, if I came in here and hit the table and you jumped, you're like, well, that was weird. If I did it again, you're like, well, that's really weird. This girl's making me jump. If I had a consistent pattern to it, that before I changed every slide, I'd walk over and hit something, be like, all right, she's about to change slides, she's probably going to hit something. But if it were completely random, if you never knew how hard I was going to hit the table, if you never knew when I was going to do it, anytime I started to walk towards you, you might start to react, you might start to jump a little bit. That is this pattern, that inconsistency of when a trauma is going to occur, when a stressor is going to occur, actually leads to activation at the neuron level that becomes higher and more acute, even to low-level stressors. The perception of inescapability also triggers sensitization. If you feel like you cannot escape what is happening to you, it doesn't matter whether it's high, whether it's low, whether it's all the time, whether it's only sometimes, but you have no control over escaping it, which is the way a lot of children feel, because literally they have no way to escape it, you're going to see a sensitizing effect as well. This breaks it down. Stress that is predictable, moderate, and controlled is good stress, and it promotes resilience. The outcome is resilience to stressors. Stress that is unpredictable, severe, and prolonged that leads to vulnerability to stress. That leads to a sensitized system that reacts even to low-level stressors. So this is a fantastic chart that really kind of highlights the way that people respond to stressors. So down here, we're going to see the intensity of the stressor. This is baseline. This is just sitting in a lecture listening to somebody talk. As you move along this axis, you're going to see the intensity of the stressor increase up to stress, all the way up to an extreme. Here we're going to see the mental states. Here we're calm, relaxed, alert, alarmed, fear, and then terror. For a person who's neurotypical, who has a pretty average experience with stress, hasn't really had chronic exposure to stress, whether it's predictable or unpredictable, they're going to move in a linear pattern like this. If the stressor is low, if they're a baseline, they're going to feel fairly calm. A little bit higher, they're going to feel alert. A little bit higher, they're going to be alarmed. And it's really going to take getting all the way up to extreme stress until that person is in terror. Now, for someone who's resilient, someone who's experienced significant stress in their life, but it was predictable, they had a sense of control, they were able to make decisions and escape, they're going to develop resilience. And so even as stress increases, they're able to stay in a lower mental state until you hit extreme stress, and then naturally you're going to spike up. But you're able to stay far lower for far longer when you're resilient. Sensitized individuals though, which is what a lot of our kiddos who experience chronic, complex trauma, they're up here. Even at low-level stressors, they're highly reactive to the stress. That even when they're still in the baseline area, they're alert, they're alarmed. And once we get to stress, a significant stress, we're all the way up in fear and terror. Predictability of a stress is the single most likely predictor of resilience. If a child experiences predictability, then they're more likely to be resilient to what they experienced. A fantastic example of this is, I'm a clinical therapist, and I recently worked with a young man who was removed from his mother and father because of physical abuse. And he was seeing me because of his depression and his anxiety and his behavioral problems in school. And one day, we had a lot of rapport, we had a good connection, and I asked him, what happened when you got beat? And he said, I made my dad beat me. And I was kind of surprised, and I said, why? And he said, because if I screwed up, if I got a bad grade, if I got into a fight at school, I knew he was going to beat me, but I knew he wouldn't beat me the next day. I could decide when he beat me, instead of me constantly waiting for me to walk in the room and get punched in the head. That kiddo, while it may not seem like it, was actually more resilient than a lot of the kiddos that I met who couldn't figure out a way to create predictability and control with their stress. So now I want to talk a little bit about the impact of complex trauma on cognition. This has a significant impact for us as school psychologists. We are trained to see SLD, intellectual disability, autism. Here I want to talk about the ways that complex trauma can impact cognitive functioning in a way that truly affects students in the classroom.
This is Dr. Solutions. You will not see things in a complex, nuanced way. And so, in a real way, it's if you looked at, if you would, the IQ that you could reflect when you're calm, it's going to be relatively high. And if, let's say, you have an IQ of somewhere between 120 and 100, you're a little bit above average, and all of a sudden you start to go out into the real world and everyday activities, you actually are going to solve problems in a way that's a little bit less intelligent. you would if you had lots of time to reflect on the issue. And the more threatened you get, literally, the dumber you get. And so people who are under threat, people who feel threatened, people who are in situations where there's chronic unpredictability, where there's stress and threat, will have problem-solving approaches that are much, much less intelligent than they could solve if they themselves had a more predictable situation, if they had more economic resources, if they had more housing stability, if they had more healthy relational supports. They would have problem solving that would reflect a higher IQ. And again, this is a crucial aspect of state-dependent functioning. All functioning, the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave, is going to be influenced by your state. Now, this is something that we see all the time in working with children and adults who've been impacted by trauma. Their functioning and their behavior and their decision-making tends to be less competent, less capable, less mature than would be possible if the very same people were put in situations where they were safe. And again, we'll come back and talk about this in greater detail on many future of our clinically oriented.
So again, as Dr. Perry was talking about there, we really see that the state that our mind is in when we're functioning impacts our functional IQ. When somebody is in a state of calm, they're in a state of flow, they're able to engage, they're able to be creative, they feel safe, they feel content, we can access the neocortex. We can be cortex available, we can experience those things that make us most human: creativity, art, connection, hope. As, however, stress impacts us and we move down into the lower parts of the brain and the locus of control moves down into the lower parts of the brain, our IQ actually goes down and we become more concrete, we become more reactive. Chronically stressed brains are less cortex available. As a result, complex cognitive processing is significantly impacted. So this isn't just input coming in from the somatosensory areas. This is more complex processing. So first we see executive functioning impact, especially attention. If you're constantly attending to everything around you, assessing it for threat, it's going to be harder to pay attention to the paragraph that you're supposed to be reading and answering questions about. If you're constantly monitoring your teacher's body language, because at home that's what keeps you safe from an abusive parent, it's going to be harder to pay attention to what your teacher says. Also impacted are things like memory. Memory is significantly impacted in the brain. Memory is tied to the amygdala, which is actually in the limbic system. And so you have chronic activation of those limbic pathways. The amygdala is not going to work as well, and it's not going to code memory as well. You also see difficulties in planning, higher order auditory visual processing, especially the integration of those two, which is fundamental in reading. Phonological processing, again, that reading impact. So you see a consistent pattern and a high likelihood of complex cognitive and executive functioning impact, which sounds a lot like SLD. So here I'm going to speak on, or the presenter is going to speak on some of the impact that trauma can have in the classroom and the way they can impact learning.
Well, let me start with, what does it look like in school? What do these impacts look like in school? And I'm going to talk about academics, behavior, and relationships. And on the academic side, I'm going to talk about two areas. One is foundations for learning, and the other is learning process. In foundations for learning, the first thing is language. The ability to comprehend and utilize expressive language, both verbally and non-verbally. Ability to understand body language or non-verbal elements of communication to be as hindered as the linguistic side. And again, I want to be clear, not every child presents with this, but as I go through the list, pick one or two and see what that does to the child's ability to perform in school. And so, ability to process and utilize language. Memory, particularly sequential memory, cause effect, if A then B. The ability to develop meaningful chronologies. Think about how we teach critical thinking in ELA. We read a story. Before we get to the end of the story, we say, what do you think is going to happen next? We're asking the child to take information, organize it, and make a reasonable prediction about what might happen next. And whether they get the right answer or not isn't the issue. The issue is, can they utilize this process? Because that is the critical thinking we want to teach them. Mindful, upper brain level mindful, right? Think about a student who's impacted by traumatic experience and can't create these sequential cause-effect chronologies. I watched a second grade child in a reading group, world reading, and the teacher's reading a book about two kids. Money, going to the store, buy bread and milk. And the students are listening, kids get to the front of the store, she stops the store and says, what do you think is going to happen next, children? This one kid raises his hand, but frantically. She goes, yes? Joey, tell us, what do you think is going to happen next? Oh, they're going to buy a dog. And she dealt with that in a very nice way, well, they're going to buy something, but it's not a dog. And does anyone else? It was bread and milk, and so everything's cool. After the lesson, I sit with the child, someone who knows the child, and I asked him, I said, why do you say dog? He said, I always wanted a dog. And I know they were going to buy something, but I figured, why not a dog? Well, is he really developing critical thinking? I mean, he got a couple of pieces. They're at the store, they're going to buy something. But the whole thing of mom asking, bread, milk, here's the money, I mean, think of that chronology. He's taking his own desires and wants, he's projecting it into the story. It's not about critical thinking for him, it's about, I got a couple pieces out of the story, let me kind of project my own piece in. That's the way it goes, right? Let's talk about academic performance, learning process, ability to get work done. I start here with executive function. Executive function is something we do every day. It's about identifying the goal, creating a plan to accomplish that goal, executing the plan, taking the action, and then stepping back and saying, how did that work for me? Reviewing that. And if it worked for me, I was able to get that task done in an effective way, as I define effective, then I'm going to remember that process. I'm going to store it away, and the next time I have to do that, I'm going to reach out, grab it, and I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to use it again. And what did I just describe? A remembered cause-effect chronology of goal setting, planning, execution, and review. If I have trouble with sequential memory, if I have trouble with cause-effect, I'm not going to be able to do this. Every time I'm presenting a task, it's going to be like it's the first time I've seen that task. I come into your classroom and have been doing it this way all year long, but maybe I'm still struggling with how do I begin this task. Transitions. Transitions can be very difficult for students impacted by traumatic experience. Think about that student who's, those MRI pictures. Now he comes into the classroom, sits in the back corner of the room. Got a whiteboard here, a bunch of windows there, and scanning. What's the noise in the hallway? How close is the teacher to me? Is he talking about me? What's that noise over there? And they're constantly scanning, looking for it. Think of your own self when you don't feel safe. We have all these filters that kind of keep extraneous information away from us, right? We filter stuff out, we stay focused, right? But when we're not feeling safe, what happens to those filters? Boom, they're down. I'm hearing everything. Well, here's this child in the back of the room, hearing everything, seeing everything. And it gets kind of quiet, transition's done, and the classroom gets quiet because now people have work to do and they're starting to do the work. And so the child goes, okay, so what's happening here? And there's a paper on his desk and people working. And it would be great if that child raised their hand and said, excuse me, I've been a little hyper-vigilant here in the back of the room, and I don't have any idea about what this paper is about. Could you help me out? It actually would be great, wouldn't it? Up to that much self-worth. But of course they don't do that. In the best of circumstances, you get a student who has skills to get through the lesson. Name, date, Is there a word bank around like, hey, Joe, don't look at any paper. You can do this yourself. Okay, right? That's the best. And again, we're not building framework, cognitive scaffolding. We're developing splinter skills to get through the lesson. Let me get through. Let me get to the end of this period. This student, will use these different skills to get through the lesson, and that's the best situation. Imagine the student says, I'm not working today. Tears the paper in half. Throws an F-bomb out. I used to think that F-bombs didn't occur in elementary school. I know. Naive joke. So that's transitions and how they can be difficult. Attention. Now think about this student I just described, who's paying all this attention to all this stuff. Is this student, because a lot of these kids will come with ADHD diagnoses. But what they found is it's not that they're not paying attention. They're in fact paying very close attention to all the wrong stuff. Right? Tone of voice, physical space, things that are happening that we're probably filtering out. I worked with this child, and I was walking down the hallway early in the morning, and I walked by the teacher's room, and she goes, Joe. He's just, we're not starting the day well. Do you have a few minutes? Sure. Come on. So we go for a walk. We sit down in a space that's available. And I say, what's up? And we're talking, and he's just somewhere else. You can see in his eyes. He's not with me. He's somewhere else. And I go, oh, what's up? What's going on? And I know him pretty well. And he goes, do you hear that noise? And I listen quietly. And I can't hear it. And I'm thinking, oh, great, auditory hallucinations. I said, no, really, what noise? He goes, it's like a machine. And I listen again, and you hear this very faint, low-frequency rumble of heavy equipment. I go, that noise? Yeah. I said, yeah. He goes, yeah, I hear it. He goes, do you think they're going to dig and hit a gas pipe like what happened on Elm Street last week? And the week before, in the city, backhoe had been digging on the street, accidentally hit a gas line. Gas went into the house, blew the house to smithereens. Now, fortunately, there was no one home. But he comes into school, he hears that low frequency that most of us are totally tuned out. And he's sitting in that class wondering, where do I go when school blows up? When is the school? Is it now? Is it now? So he's in this agitated, hypervigilant state. And I say, oh, they're just spreading dirt out in the playground out there. Because, really? So, okay, so we get up and we walk out, and there's a big bulldozer spreading a pile of dirt. I said, see? They're not digging. We stopped a nice person driving the Caterpillar bulldozer. I said, excuse me. Go ahead, ask him. Are you going to dig any holes? No, Sonny, we're just spreading dirt today, not digging any holes. And you watch this child, just relax. All that tension went out because the school wasn't going to blow up because of the gas leak. Right? Went back in. I didn't see him for the rest of the day, so I'm assuming he had a pretty good rest of the day. Right? But that's, when we talk about attention and hearing all this and where are they, gives you a sense of what can be going on in the head.
So that video gives you a really good understanding of some of the cognitive and learning impact that trauma can have. Now I want to discuss the most common impact that trauma can have, which is on behavior. A lot of kids, a lot of adults too, but a lot of kids express their internal state through their behavior. If I'm sad, I'm going to sulk. I'm going to withdraw into myself. I'm going to not really pay attention to what you're doing. I'm going to be zoned off. If I'm frustrated, I might act out. The problem with trauma, and going back to that sensitization process, is trauma significantly impacts behavior. In particular because of the nature of the threat response patterns. We've all heard about fight or flight. You're walking down the trail, you're up in the San Bernardino Mountains, and you're walking down, or I don't think we have bears up there. All right, you're up in the Sierra Nevadas. And you're walking down a trail, and all of a sudden you see a bear. You aren't going to sit there and think, I wonder if this is a nice bear. I wonder if this is a queen bear. Should I go up and make friends with the bear? What do I know about bear and bear behavior? No, you're probably either going to freeze to see what's going on and to assess the situation, or you are going to run out of there. That is our natural response. So that's fight or flight. So yes, you freeze, but then you flee. Or you punch the bear, you fight the bear. You punch the bear in the nose, and then you run away. Fight or flight. Freeze is another one that we talk about a lot. Freeze can happen for a moment, and then you engage in fight or flight, or it can be your overriding response to a stressor. We also have what's called flock. Flock is a stress response to a relatively low-level stressor. This is when we have the ability to respond to a low-level stressor appropriately, so we aren't overly sensitized. We're kind of on that neurotypical or that resilient path. And we can say, what's everybody else doing? Imagine a kid who goes to a new school on the first day. And he's never been there before, he's sitting in the classroom, and all of a sudden an alarm goes off and everybody jumps up, throws their arms in the air. He's going to be like, what's going on? And then the next period he does that, he sees it, and he does it with them, because he's assessed what the social response is, so he knows that that's an appropriate way to engage. The difficult thing is, though, with sensitized systems and with complex trauma is when threat response system behavior becomes a pattern of behavior, instead of just in response to something like a bear on a trail, it's the way you engage in your day-to-day life. Those responses and those behaviors become maladaptive and they become problematic. So here, we're going to look at the two parts of the threat response continuum. The arousal continuum, fight or flight, and then also the dissociative continuum, which captures freeze. Flock is kind of somewhere in the middle, because again, you're not really seeing something as a huge threat that you need to escape. There isn't a significant immediacy to it. You still have the space and the resources to assess other people's responses. These are when threats get more significant. And the responses, as I said just now with my bear example, if you kind of freeze and then you assess and then you respond, that shows that threat responses are often heterogeneous. You aren't either a fight or flight person or a freeze person. You're not aroused, you're not dissociated. You tend to move through them. So the arousal continuum, this is fight or flight. The body prepares itself for one of these two options. So you actually see changes across the body. You see the heart rate increase, pumping more blood out to the muscles so that muscles are stronger, better able to hit or to run. You see increased respiration. You actually see an increase in visual acuity because, again, imagine you're running away from that bear. You don't want to fall and twist your ankle in a hole. So your visual acuity actually improves. You see an activation of the limbic system, including the amygdala. Makes you feel pissed at whatever is attacking you so that you fight back or you run even harder. You also have an increased awareness of the outside world. You are taking in data from the somatosensory systems at an intense rate. You are assessing everything. You are looking at the temperature, you're looking at all this. None of it's making up to the gray wrinkly bits. This is not a cortex response. But you're bringing in all of this information. The arousal continuum does include a little bit more of the flock because you are alert to the social responses, but it's also got kind of the dissociative part in it too. So these are some of the signs and symptoms. Hypervigilance, impulsivity, anger, aggression, feeling threatened or in danger almost constantly, a sense of time slowing down. When you are in this aroused state, time literally moves slower to give you more time to respond. You have a rapid heartbeat, your body can tingle, heightened senses. You actually see these two things, especially in chronic activation of the arousal system. A really good trauma question to ask a kiddo where you suspect that there may be chronic trauma going on is, how's your appetite? Asking a parent, how is his appetite? Kiddos who are chronically sensitized and chronically stressed and chronically on the arousal continuum are going to have low appetite. They may have failure to thrive to where they struggle with gaining weight. You're also going to see significantly impaired sleep. The brain never goes offline enough to go into a full REM sleep, so you're constantly activated. On the other side, we see the dissociative continuum. This is the freeze side. This gets triggered when the body prepares itself to be seriously injured. This happens when there's inescapability to the trauma. This happens in children. This happens in the elderly. This happens in those who are already injured. When you're faced with a significant threat of bodily harm, or at least the way that your brain perceives it, and there's no way to escape it, your body actually shuts down. The brain releases endogenous opioids, dopamine, and endorphins to help you tolerate the trauma of what you're about to experience. The entire system slows down. Your heart rate slows down to pull blood in from the extremities into your trunk. That way, if you're attacked on the arm or the leg, you're less likely to bleed out. You see slowed respiration, slowed peripheral circulation. There's a decreased awareness of the outside world. The brain actually kind of turns in on itself to where the outside world becomes less bright, less vibrant, less real. There's a sense of derealization to where the outside world isn't really there. And there's an overall numbing of experience. The body goes numb, the mind goes numb in preparation of just trying to survive an attack. The signs of this are avoidance, inattention, numbing, compliance actually. Kiddos who will comply with any directive, it's almost a sense of learned helplessness. They just comply. They have no fight to argue. They have no fight to assert themselves. They just do whatever they need to do to survive. You see a suspension of time here to where it's not that time slows down, it's that actually time starts to lose meaning. Derealization to where the world doesn't feel real. Fainting. You can even see psychotic symptoms to where you see hallucinations, both auditory and visual, because the brain is not processing things as rapidly, and so external stimuli like sounds are actually perceived in a hallucinatory manner. And then catatonia, which is the phrase catatonic, literally losing awareness even though you are awake. So the eyes are open, but nobody's home. So these are adaptive responses to threat. These responses are how we protect ourselves when we're threatened. Different factors are going to impact what type of response we're going to have. For children, for infants, for those who can't escape, they're going to have an opossum approach, play dead. They're going to stay more heavily on the dissociative side, whereas an adult who can fight, an adult who can flee, they're going to be over more on the arousal side of the continuum, more like a deer jumping out of the way. The response is going to shift over the course of the traumatic event to where you're going to see people moving in and out of these different continuums, where 1 minute they seem compliant, then highly reactive, and then back to numb and dissociated. You're going to see movement through these responses. The impact that it has on classroom behavior can basically be all of the negative behaviors that you see for kiddos. We talked about some of the symptoms. It can be aggression. It can be not paying attention. It can be struggling to maintain their own emotional stability because their emotions are up and down and all over the place. You also may see testing behavior. If a child feels that adults are not safe, that adults consistently have not been safe, they may test your safety to see if you get to a point where you harm them. So when I really piss my dad off, he hits me. What's it going to take for you to hit me? Kids have a sense to where, again, going back to that sense of control, if I can take control, if I can figure out exactly where you harmed me, the way that all the other adults in my life have harmed me, then I can be in control to where I don't have to worry about when it's going to happen. I can take more control over that distress rather than anticipating it happening at any moment. This obviously has a significant impact on relationships. I think that that's probably the most depressing part of complex trauma is the way that it strips these kids who have already been harmed of relationships with people who are safe because they don't understand what they're going through. We're fundamentally relational social creatures. Our brains literally die off if we do not have, major parts of it at least, literally die off if we don't have social interaction. But when you have a kiddo who has an unsecure attachment, when they can never trust that a person's going to be there to take care of them, when they can never feel safe in relationships, you're going to see maladaptive behaviors and maladaptive relational dynamics. Part of it is going to be modeled from the parents or the environment, the community, there's community violence. Part of it may be modeled behavior that the kid, this is the only way that they've seen people behave. Others will be testing behaviors. I'm going to see how far, what you'll take from me before you hurt me. Also, the sensitization, the neurological realities of complex trauma. It actually makes intimacy with another person a trigger. So let's go back to the key components of complex trauma. The infant brain is fundamentally malleable. It is waiting for experience to tell it how to organize itself. If those experiences are consistent, if they're predictable, and if they have a reliable caregiver that steps in and relieves the stress, they're actually going to develop in a way that's neurotypical or even resilient. Chronically chaotic and high-stress environments, however, are going to impact the child's developing brain at the neurological level. They're going to be more easily triggered by even small-level stressors. A sensitized brain is more reactive to threats, to low-intensity stressors that they then interpret as threats. And the functional response to these stressors and to these stresses and to these threats is more extreme. You see more extreme behaviors than you would see in a kiddo who has a neurotypical development. The brain of a child with complex trauma is primed for stress response. The lower areas of the brain are the most strongly developed. They're the areas that respond more quickly to trauma, and those are the areas that have been developed. It hasn't been primed for more complex relational and human activities. This is one of my favorite quotes about complex trauma. Capital T trauma, or single event trauma as we've described here, impacts children, there is no doubt. But the impact at a neurostructural level is minimal compared to what a pattern of frequent and unpredictable traumatic insults does to a developing brain. Those frequent doses of stress and fear impacts and alters the brain at multiple points of development, literally shaping it into an organ that is more reactive, more sensitized, more primal. One where the basic attributes of our humanness, abstract thought, creativity, empathy, hope, are fundamentally less developed and available. So I want to take you back to our typical reactions to a child in school that comes with a single event trauma. A parent lost in a car accident, a home that burned down. We approach them with compassion and understanding and patience. We understand that their behavior is separate from who they are, and we have a lowered expectation of self-control in the immediate aftermath of their trauma. We're nurturing, and we strengthen our relationship with them to give them a safe place. These are some of our reactions to children with complex trauma. Frustration and annoyance, minimizing their trauma. Well, I went through this when I was growing up, and look at how I am. Why aren't you controlling your behavior better? Attributing behavior and emotions to choice and personality. You're a bad kid. You are defiant. You are rude. Rather than the impact of their experiences. We actually have an increased expectation of self-control. If we woke up in the morning, and to take an example of a kiddo that I used to work with, he'd wake up in the morning, His mom would be passed out on the couch. There'd be some random guy there who had spent the night. He never knew who. He woke up, he went into the pantry, he would pick the bugs out of his cereal as he ate it. He would walk to school, never knowing if he was going to get jumped on the way there, if his shoes were going to be stolen, or if he was going to be seriously harmed. He was angry. He was cold most mornings because he didn't have a coat. He had told some of his teachers about some of the things that had happened, and they called CPS, and CPS didn't have enough evidence to substantiate neglect because when they got there, it was right after the food stamps had come in, so they had food in the house. This is what his mornings looked like. And then he got to school, still warming up, still hungry, and his teacher was frustrated that he didn't have his homework done. And she called him lazy. If we had gone through all of that, if we had had that kind of morning, my homework wouldn't have been done. Yet we expect more of these kids than we would expect of ourselves in similar circumstances. We weaken our relationships with these kids. We weaken the connection, and yes, their behaviors are difficult. Their behaviors are incredibly challenging to connect to. I completely understand that. I've been in session with these kids. It's hard. You leave it exhausted. But we have a tendency to pull back, to weaken the connection because they're difficult to deal with. We communicate and we reinforce shame. That they ought to be ashamed of their behavior. They ought to be ashamed of their emotions, their reactions. And that they ought to be ashamed of who they are. Those who are the hardest to love are the ones that need it the most. Trauma and stress reactivity in schools. Trauma impacts children across domains. It's kind of been the overriding theme of this talk. Students with single event trauma, yes, they are impacted. I am not minimizing that. But a lot of those kids are also supported, whereas kids with complex trauma, it's much more pronounced and they need much more support. Increasing trauma sensitivity and plans for intervention are key. Teachers need training. Administrators need training. We need to help people understand that this is not because my client is a bad kid. It is not because this student is a bad kid. It's because their environment has changed their brain. We need to support understanding and empathy for these students and facilitate connection. Positive relationships with safe and regulated adults is the single most effective intervention for children with complex trauma. So what does this mean? This isn't a completely doomsday presentation of a talk. I'm not telling you that all of these kids are hopeless and that the world is an awful place and that everything's going to go down in flames. There actually is hope for this situation. The brain wants to be in equilibrium, and because of the neuroplasticity of the brain, it can reshape those networks that were formed by those morphogens into areas of reactivity and reshape them into more complex areas of connection. Modeling connection, modeling positive relationships, modeling self-regulation is the way that that neurogenesis happens. If school can become a source of connection, a source of safety, and a place of healing for students with complex trauma, rather than a source of continued shame and disconnection, it can be that if an understanding of trauma can become a part of a school's culture and values. Students who are loved at home come to school to learn. And those students who aren't, they come to school to be loved. So that's my talk on complex trauma and the way that it impacts children in school. This is kind of a little addendum to that. I'm a clinical therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I know diagnosis. It's one of my areas of strength. I understand all the different diagnoses in the DSM. And I see over and over and over and over again kiddos with trauma who come in with a laundry list of diagnoses. major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder unspecified, ADHD combined presentation, disrupted mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD, sorry. You see this list of mental health disorders and you're like, wow, this kid must be really messed up. Yes, but not necessarily. Trauma and stress reactivity can underline, exacerbate, and even mimic other psychiatric disorders. Everywhere from ADHD all the way up to schizophrenia. This fact may not change the mental health diagnosis. Diagnoses are basically, here is this constellation of symptoms that fits best to describe this person, this is the name for it. So, if that person is exhibiting that cluster of symptoms, then yes, that diagnosis is appropriate. It also may not change the IDEA classification. I'm not saying that all of these children should be made ED. I'm not saying that you should drop OHI because it may be trauma, not true ADHD. But I think it's important when you see a laundry list of diagnoses to understand what that could mean and what that could mean for response and intervention. More diagnoses does not necessarily mean that a child is more pathological, that they're more disturbed. It may just mean that they're more damaged and that his or her trauma expression looks different at different times in their life. And so different mental health professionals have seen those different presentations and have issued diagnoses accordingly. So I'm going to go through each of the major diagnostic categories, talk a little bit about what the DSM is characterizing them, the cluster of symptoms that it's looking for, and briefly go through some of the ways that trauma could mimic, exacerbate, or create those symptoms. So depressive disorders, Squidward. These are characterized by depressed mood, obviously. People with depression have depressed mood. You also are going to see changes in sleep and appetite. Typically, you're either going to see hypersomnia, too much sleeping, or insomnia, not enough or disturbed sleeping. You're going to see that appetite going down, or appetite going up. Plenty of us comfort eat when we're feeling sad. You're going to see diminished interest in previously enjoyed activities, fatigue, low motivation, poor concentration, possibly impaired learning. There also is, with depressive disorders, a risk of suicidality as well as self-harm. The trauma connection. All of this looks a lot like the dissociative continuum. You see a lot of avoidance, you see a lot of numbing, dissociation. Could be learned helplessness. Nothing I do makes anything okay. Nothing I do makes me safe. So why am I going to do anything? It may be meaning making about their own trauma. If somebody hurt me so bad, am I worthless? If my environment is so awful, maybe that's just the way that the world is. And shame. And sometimes safe adults can continue to reinforce that. Bipolar disorders. Here we're looking at, some of these were gifts and apparently they're not working. So bipolar disorders have all of the characteristics of depression as well as acute periods of what's called mania. So a mania is a distinct period, typically about 2 to 7 days, where you have significantly elevated mood. And when I say elevated, I don't necessarily mean good, though it often starts out that way. It's just a mood that is very intense. So it can be extremely elevated, extremely excited, extremely happy, could be extremely expansive, could also be very, very irritable and angry and full of rage. And then you see an increase in energy. I had a kiddo who was having her first manic episode. She went 7 days without sleeping, which sounds a lot like a meth bender, but it was actually just her own mania. If a kid looks like they're doing meth, check to see if they're doing meth first, and then maybe explore possible bipolar. You're also going to see inflated self-esteem, a reduced need for sleep, racing thoughts that just go like this. High distractibility. You're also going to see a lot of high-risk behaviors. The trauma connection. Again, this is that vacillation between hyper-aroused and hypo-aroused. The vacillation between the arousal continuum at its most extreme forms, and then the dissociative continuum at a pretty extreme form. Anxiety disorders. Here, anxiety consists of two parts: cognitive responses and physiological responses. First part is what we think of as anxiety. You're worried. Your thoughts are circular. They're going around and around and around, focused on the same thing, or they're bouncing all over the place, catastrophizing, thinking about what might happen in the future. Anxiety also has a physiological component. You're going to see racing heart, tachycardia, sweating, shortness of breath, paresthesia, which is tingling in your extremities. The trauma connection, the arousal continuum, hyperarousal, may also be very legitimate fears and worries about one's own safety, and then hypervigilance. Obsessive compulsive disorders. Obsessive compulsive disorders is kind of in the name. They're characterized by obsessions, persistent and recurrent patterns of thoughts, urges, images, or perceptions. So think about kind of the classic OCD person who is obsessed with cleanliness. The obsession is there are germs everywhere, there are germs everywhere, there are germs everywhere, there are germs there, there are germs there. The compulsion is a behavior that the person is being driven to engage in, even though they don't want to resolve the impact of the obsession. So it reduces the anxiety and the distress that the obsession causes by engaging in a behavior that takes away or resolves some aspect of the obsession, however tangential that connection may be. The trauma connection. You see intrusive worry and trauma imagery. Trauma memories can get very, very distorted. And so aspects of a trauma memory may stand out that are not consistent with the totality of the trauma experience. So I had a client who was trafficked. She was a victim of human trafficking, and she was beaten by a John. And she became absolutely obsessed with cleanliness after the fact because she was beaten in an alley. And she was afraid that her wounds were going to get infected. And so thereafter, because of the avoidance of the trauma memories, she was obsessed with keeping herself clean. Some of the physiological urges and sensations, that urge to relieve some of this stress reactivity. Like with her, constantly washing her hands, constantly washing her hair. She had bald spots because she had struck her scalp so much. Compulsions can sometimes be a means to control your own world. I can't control who hurts me. I can't control who dies in my community. At least I can control how many times I turn my lock. And compulsions is a self-soothing rhythmic behavior. This isn't necessarily stemming from an autistic standpoint. It's more there is something at a physiological level that is soothing about repetitive behaviors. And repetitive behaviors can often be a big part of OCD. Disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. These are the ones that we often see our kiddos come in with, particularly those that are being evaluated for an emotional disturbance. Some of those include oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, intermittent explosive disorder, IED, that's a relatively new one, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, DMDD, that's one I couldn't get out earlier, and then conduct disorder. We see these a lot. For it to be a DSM diagnosis, it can't just be behavior. There has to be a mood component too. So here you see irritability, you see anger, you see children who get easily frustrated, easily annoyed, highly reactive in an emotional sense. Not to crying and distress, but to anger, to some of those hot emotions. Then you see behavior, defiance, vindictiveness, verbal and physical aggression, and particularly with conduct disorder, a violation of others' rights. The trauma connection. One, this may be modeled behavior of what they see in their community, of what they see in their home. This may be the only way that these children know how to resolve conflict. Could be, kind of the theme of the talk, stress sensitization that activates the limbic system. We talked about how we react to stressors throughout the totality of the brain hierarchy, to where they're reacting with physical aggression, they're also reacting with significant angry mood. And then also, this is something that I talk about in my therapy with kids and adults. Sometimes it feels way more comfortable to feel angry than to feel sad. Or way more comfortable to feel angry than to feel vulnerable and unsafe. And so at times, students will let themselves feel angry because it's far more tolerable than some of the other scarier emotions. ADHD, this is a huge one. If you think about all the things that we've been talking about, the way that trauma can present, it sounds a lot like ADHD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and there are 3 presentations. One is the primarily inattentive type, one is the primarily hyperactive type, and one is combined presentation. Most kids that you're going to see are going to be the combined presentation. Here, again, this almost feels redundant. Inattentiveness may be a dissociative response or may be a fundamental wiring issue related to higher executive functioning. Could be avoidance. Hyperactivity could be an arousal response and behavior of being actively triggered at a sensitized system that is constantly triggered most of the day. And also tapping, moving, looking around. It could be those repetitive self-soothing behaviors. Autism. This is one that kind of surprised me when I first started learning about trauma, but now makes a lot of sense. For autism, we see persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, and then a pattern of restrictive and repetitive behaviors, interests, or activities. Those are the 2 hallmarks of autism. If you think about it, though, in students who have poor modeling of appropriate social engagement, who are triggered by intimacy in relationships, they may avoid relationships, or they may have inappropriate responses to relationships and connection. Self-soothing, rhythmic, repetitive behaviors may be a way that they're able to give themselves some semblance of comfort living within a sensitized body. They may have a need to have control over something. So I'm going to talk about airplanes for hours, because if I can control our conversation, I know that I don't have to go back to my foster home where I don't know anybody and no one speaks the language that I speak. And again, looking at that, moving back and forth along the arousal and dissociative continuum. And this, you may not see. You may not see kiddos in your schools that come with an existing schizophrenia diagnosis. But I ask you that anytime you see a kiddo, particularly a little one, but even a kiddo in middle or high school, that comes with a schizophrenia diagnosis, that you explore trauma first. Schizophrenia before late adolescence, early adulthood is extremely rare. It is extremely rare, and many of these cases are misdiagnosed. You do see some prodromal symptoms, so symptoms that come before the full-fledged activation of the psychosis. But I really, really implore you that when you see a child coming in with a schizophrenia diagnosis, you explore trauma as well. So in schizophrenia, you have both positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Symptoms that are there that shouldn't be: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech. And then symptoms that should be there but aren't. You have aphasia, where they don't speak, catatonic behavior, disorganized behavior. The hallmarks really are, though, either hallucinations, perceptual disturbances, or delusions. Paranoia being kind of the most common delusion. So if we think about a kiddo who's been chronically stressed, whose life is not safe, who may have been harmed themselves, may have just been exposed to harm, flashbacks can feel like hallucinations. Feeling like you're back, hearing your mother scream when your stepdad was beating her, and you tell somebody, I can hear my mother screaming right now, they're going to be like, well, that's a hallucination. It may just be a flashback. Paranoia that people are out to get you, that you're never safe, that people want to hurt you, that may actually be a reality. That may not be a delusion. And depersonalization, the most extreme of the dissociative continuum. Sometimes you see some of those negative behavior, those negative symptoms, the catatonic behavior, the aphasia, those things that should be there that aren't. You see those things falling away because the only way that a person can survive their day-to-day experience is by shutting everything down, turning in on themselves, and just trying to keep themselves alive. So this addendum to the talk is really to highlight some of the different mental health areas and to hopefully give you an understanding of how just because a kiddo comes to you with a laundry list of mental health diagnoses, it may just be a hurt child who's hurting. Thank you.